Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you to start heading towards your seats. Those of you in the slightly cheaper seats in back can move up to the slightly more expensive seats up front. So it's my pleasure to convene as the last session of this wonderful conference. It's been very substantively rich on the effects of persistent low productivity growth, a discussion of politics. Now, I have challenged two great experts to come into the land of the economists who all think they know something about politics but do not, and explain what really is going on in political effects in a way that we will understand and find convincing. And this is no small feat. My friend Peter Fisher and I were on a panel recently together at Columbia, and we both said, Peter first, of course, said, I'm tired of this word populism. It's too many meanings. We need something specific. And we tried economic nationalism. But anyway, there's a lot of loose talk, and I am very grateful to have Daniel Dresner and Anna Greenberg with us today to tighten that loose talk. And of course, I left their bios here. I could do both their bios from memory, but I'd probably mess something up. So first we're going to have speaking Daniel Dresner, who is professor of international politics at the Fletcher School at Tufts. Many of you know him as a regular columnist and contributing editor in title. See, I would have messed that up, at the Washington Post. He's also a non-resident senior fellow across the street at the Brookings Institution. I know Dan as one of the leading IPE people international political economy, who brings out of theory and engages in Washington. Prior to Fletcher, he taught at UChicago and the University of Colorado at Boulder, and he's previously been with the Civic Education Project, the RAND Corporation, and U.S. Department of Treasury, actually in the Treasury as a political scientist. Big points. I would also just say that we've forgiven him for the fact he wrote a book about think tanks. We don't like people looking at us too closely. I'm also very honored to have, as a discussant and more broadly a speaker, Anna Greenberg. Anna is one of the best-known pollsters with a solid academic research background and huge political reach. She's a partner at Greenberg Quinlan Rosner Research. She previously was an assistant professor of public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. We've got a few of those around here today. Greenberg serves importantly on the national board of the American National Election Study, which is the premier consortium of political scientists and others looking at polling data on the US elections. And she's a research fellow at American University Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies. She also holds a PhD in political science at the University of Chicago, which I know from her is similar battle training to having a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. So we can expect a lively discussion on that front as well. So please, Dan.
Thank you very much to the Peterson Institute. I especially thank Adam for inviting me here. As someone who started off actually getting a PhD in economics and then switching to political science 2 years in, this entire experience has brought back a whole lot of PTSD for me. It's just nice to get through that and work through that. And I am, in all seriousness, grateful in some ways to Adam for allowing me to write what I honestly think is the most depressing paper I have ever written in terms of the policy implications. So it's basically the question of, given that secular stagnation is a given, what are the political economy effects of it? And now it's my turn to see whether I can make this work. Hey, there we go. So essentially, we have this sort of general belief, and it's almost a sort of unstated assumption, a casual assumption in the United States, that just as the free market system works because it lets failures fail, the political system also functions well in the United States because if you enter a bad policy equilibrium that generates truly negative effects on voters, voters will eventually vote the bums out. That is to say, if you are actually put in charge and then the economy does not function terribly well, or you alienate capital, eventually you will see a change in who is governing, and you also see a change in the policy content of what is governing. And presumably this is one of the things that in theory is supposed to lead to the United States having relatively high rates of economic growth compared to even to other advanced industrialized democracies. At the same time, we are obviously operating in a world in which it seems like productivity growth has obviously stagnated since 1973 and has been particularly stagnant since the start of the 21st century. That's a given. We've talked the entire day about that. I'm just sort of assuming that as a background assumption. But as a political scientist, I want to add two other secular trends that have also happened during the same period that are not necessarily due to an underlying cause, but nonetheless impact the ways in which lower productivity growth has political effects. So the first trend, and this is one that if you live in this city, I'm sure you are keenly aware of, is the rise of political polarization, which is to say that if you take a look at things like House voting, you find out that Democrats, the median Democrat in the House of Representatives have moved somewhat to the left, and the median Republican in the House of Representatives have moved way, way, way to the right. That said, this can at least in part be explained by a phenomenon that political scientists like to refer to as partisan sorting. Which is to say, this doesn't necessarily mean that actors are automatically getting more extreme. What it can mean is that, let's say, people who used to be thought of as Southern Democrats now clearly identify as Republicans, whereas people who used to think of themselves as Rockefeller Republicans in the Northeast now identify as Democrats. So part of this can be explained by partisan sorting, but not all of it. You are also seeing a genuine segmentation of the American public, not just members of Congress. And furthermore, this segmentation is even more concentrated among political elites, by which I mean party activists, donors, local officials, and what have you. They have, bifurcated even further, as you can see in terms from 1994 to 2014, and this is all from the Pew Research Center's survey data. This suggests that something has changed. And furthermore, you're in a situation where even if it's just partisan sorting explaining this, you actually have a situation where elites on both sides now have an increasingly negative view on the other side, which is to say that if you take a look and sort of conduct polling or survey elites and furthermore experiments, it turns out that now elites on one side view the other side as genuinely evil, and they do not want their children to marry outside of their political persuasion. And furthermore, in experimental evidence, there's evidence that shows that elites on both sides that are strongly partisan are more likely to discriminate in the workplace based on political affiliation than on race or gender or sexual orientation. So the point is, you're not just seeing polarization, you're also seeing a breakdown in any kind of cooperation between the two parties. The other trend, which has been commented on in the last section, is, of course, the rise of economic inequality, whether we're talking about incomes or whether we're talking about wealth. Simply put, as a political scientist would put it, life has been pretty good for the 1%, life has been really, really good for the top 0.1%, and life has been super awesome for the top 0.01% of the country. And furthermore, this is particularly concentrated within the United States in terms of the distribution of benefits over time. So the interesting thing in terms of what this means is that with economic inequality also comes political inequality. So these are the results from a survey that Page and Seawright did of high net worth individuals in the Chicago region, asking them whether they have done things such as made contact with their senator, made contact with the representative, met with a White House official, and so on and so forth. Now, as you can imagine, the median response, if you surveyed the mass public, would be 0 on all of these. This normally does not happen. On the other hand, if you take a look at these sort of high net worth individuals, you are talking about a relatively high degree of contact that high net worth individuals have with the political elite, and obviously with that kind of contact can potentially come political influence. This matters because, as it turns out, relatively high net worth individuals, or plutocrats, or whatever you want to call them, have a set of political views that is somewhat distinct from either what we might consider the left or even in some cases the right, which is to say they are by and large libertarian in their policy preferences. Now, by libertarian, I don't want to go so far as to say they're Randian. They don't want to see a total elimination of the state. If you take a look at sort of median positions of high net worth individuals, they want to see funding of things like basic research and so on and so forth. But as a general rule, there is a large gap between how high net worth individuals feel in terms of funding things like environmental protection, homeland security, healthcare, social security, and defense spending. And that gap is relatively large. And furthermore, it goes beyond that to talk about attitudes in terms of whether or not the role of the state in terms of providing for public security or public goods or redistribution in American society, which is needless to say, high net worth individuals by and large are hostile to the concept of redistribution. They don't think that it works. They are strongly and firmly believers in the notion that they got to where they are entirely based on their own skill and will, and not due to maybe, just maybe, the possibility that they were born on third base. And this matters in terms of public policy. Furthermore, this belief, much like in the examples of partisan sorting, this belief is reinforced by the fact that many of these people wind up only interacting with each other in a whole series of conferences ranging from the Davos, the World Economic Forum at Davos, to TED, to the Aspen Ideas Festival, to the Milken Global Conference, to PopTech, and so on and so forth. The point being that by and large, as Darrell West pointed out in his book on billionaires, the rich have somewhat different views than you or I do. Regardless of whether you're talking about Republicans or Democrats in terms of social issues, high net worth individuals do have disagreements on that. But in terms of economic issues, in terms of attitudes about regulation, in terms of attitudes about the state, by and large, high net worth individuals are, relatively speaking, libertarian. So this matters because by and large, you're seeing two trends that in some ways are now contradictory and are coming to a head. On the one hand, high net worth individuals are responsible for an ever greater share of money involved in political campaign spending. So particularly, I believe Bonica et al. Studies showed that in 1982, the top 0.01% was responsible for approximately 10% of all campaign spending. By 2012, that number was up to 40%. So you're talking about a significant chunk of money that is coming strictly from the top 0.01% of the country, and that obviously can affect the ways and the positions in which candidates might adopt in order to be able to get money from these individuals. And this has led to a raft of books arguing that essentially these plutocrats genuinely control or direct policy views in the political sphere. But the problem is that that is running up against the polarization trend, because the polarization trend leads to something different. So this is a chart from Lee Drutman's survey of the 2016 electorate, basically asking people to self-identify in terms of their attitudes about both economic regulation and about national identity. And basically what you notice here is that most of the country is starting to split into two populist extremes. The lower, there we go. This area are economic populists. These are people who, generally speaking, like the idea of the government taking steps in order to ensure more economic fairness, but nonetheless view themselves as relatively cosmopolitan in terms of how they see themselves as Americans vis-a-vis the rest of the world. This quadrant are the Trump supporters. These are the ones who simultaneously, have a strong sense of national identity and are relatively, have a benign attitude about economic regulation. The problem is, this is where high net worth individuals are. They are relatively cosmopolitan in their worldview. They want to, they embrace the idea of globalization. They believe that on the whole it's beneficial. And at the same time, they don't want the state to play large of a role. But as you notice, this is easily the least populated quadrant of these four. And so you have the following paradox. You have high net worth individuals responsible for an ever-increasing share of political spending, but they are trying to push against a gale force wind in which they are dealing with people that have one set of policy views that they don't like. So essentially, they have this kind of choice. They are either dealing with economic populists in the form of Bernie Sanders that will potentially, propose a whole array of policies that they feel will cut into their net worth, but they also have to deal with possibility of populist nationalists who, on a variety of economic dimensions in terms of things like trade or immigration, will also take actions that will cut potentially against their bottom line, and also they may find morally offensive for one reason or another. So this basically leaves high net worth individuals with one of three possible options to cope with this. So one possibility is they can actually try to use their funds as a way to try to persuade the public to actually adopt their particular views. God knows if they have this much money, they can presumably fund things like think tanks and public relations efforts and polling efforts as a way to try to move the public sentiment on these issues in a more libertarian direction. And this is what some people argue is happening with things like the Koch network or what have you. The second option is to side with economic populists. They can decide that in the end what they want to do is realize the handwriting on the wall, try to make some sort of deal with the Democratic left in a way in which they feel like they will nonetheless be able to thrive, or they can side with national populists. So, in terms of persuasion, and here I will engage in a shameless bit of self-promotion, this does not work. By and large, this will not work. The problem is that by and large, on these cases, the public, high net worth individuals will be trying to push against a public that is so heavily polarized that they could, amass all of the expert opinions in the world, and by and large, it will not shift public opinion. There's a paper that just came out by Elizabeth Saunders and Alexandra Gushinger that shows that on issues in which there is already a polarized public opinion, meaning there is already an issue in which is thought of as highly politically salient, if you introduce the notion that there is an expert consensus that one side or the other is correct, it has absolutely no effect whatsoever on public sentiment. If, on the other hand, to be fair, if there are issues on which the public hasn't necessarily been motivated for, in other words, it hasn't become politically polarized, expert opinion can shift the public. But on an array of issues in terms of taxes and regulation, those are already polarized. And so as a result, persuasion in terms of what the state should do isn't going to work. And that's not just my conclusion, but the conclusion of a whole raft of books that have come out this year. So another option is that they could side with left populists. And you could argue there are at least some examples of this happening over the last year as Donald Trump has been elected president, namely reactions to the Muslim ban. I believe that's a photo of Sergey Brin at the San Francisco airport when the first Muslim ban was announced, at which point you had people rushing to the airports to protest it. When you had President Trump pulling out of the Paris climate change accords, you saw the collapse of various business councils that Trump had ostensibly put forward to try to coordinate with owners of capital. Maybe it's the case that they're simply so affronted by Trump that they will decide to go to the left. And this is where I do think the productivity slowdown essentially makes this impossible. It used to be the case that members of the left or parties on the left could make the following political compact with capital, which is to say, listen, if you side with us, we are going to do things like tax you more and regulate you more for a variety of reasons. However, in return for that, we will also be willing to invest in more public goods, and that will lead to higher rates of economic growth. And that was, generally speaking, an argument that seemed to have some degree of validity in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And indeed, you can argue that the whole existence of the third way, both in the Clinton administration and in the Tony Blair administration in the United Kingdom, was premised on this notion that simultaneously we will raise taxes on you somewhat, we will regulate you a little more, but look at the economic growth we will generate. The problem, of course, is that in a productivity slowdown, that promise no longer holds any appeal. Simply put, capital will not believe it. And indeed, furthermore, polarization has essentially rendered this bargain politically unappetizing for the left. As a result, you have people like Bernie Sanders not focusing on economic growth, but focusing explicitly on redistribution as the way, forward in terms of economic policy. And this is something that, understandably, if you're an owner of capital, you might resist for self-interested reasons. On the other hand, if they decide to swipe right, they can deal with an administration that might be hostile to them on certain sets of issues, namely with respect to international economic policy, but nonetheless can at least offer an array of distributional policies that clearly benefit capital, namely in the form of tax cuts, in the form of deregulation, and in the form of lax antitrust enforcement. These are all areas where owners of capital might have a genuine preference for it. It's not that they're expecting to see higher rates of economic growth from these sets of policies, but in a situation where the pie is not necessarily growing, maximizing your share of the pie is the logical strategy. And the one thing that populist nationalists can offer these people is potentially a greater share of the existing pie. And indeed, we have seen this in the whole array of policies that the Trump administration has put forward in their first year in office. Whether you looked at what the health care plans that admittedly did not come to pass, but nonetheless were being floated, and just about any version of the tax cuts proposals that are now being put forward, all of which seem to basically disproportionately benefit the top 1%. Now, of course, this isn't perfect. This is a second best option for high net worth individuals. They would much rather have a more free market oriented president. But they can probably find workarounds for issues like immigration restriction or trade protectionism. There are substitutable policies they can pursue, whether in the form of foreign direct investment or outsourcing domestically, which again are not ideal but minimize the blowback from those kinds of policies in an easier way than if they have to deal with a far left party that is far more interested in taxing them at a higher rate. So as a result, you wind up with a world in which they do relatively well, in which potentially this leads to increases not just in terms of the rate of return, but also increases in capital gains as well. And as a result, that's in some ways for them the best distributional outcome. They're not necessarily going to have higher rates of growth. They understand that, but they are going to get more of the existing status quo. And indeed, I think the asset boom potentially confirms this. Now, furthermore, the other reason they might make this deal is because that they recognize that essentially, as much as they might want to dislodge Trump's control over the Republican Party, the simple fact is they can't, because the one thing that Donald Trump did innovate in the 2016 campaign was that he adopted a set of policy positions that were far more consistent with what the average median Republican views about issues like immigration and trade than Republican Party elites. The truth is that for 30 years or so, GOP party elites have adopted a much more friendly attitude towards globalization than the median GOP voter. And so in some ways, the Trump innovation was not necessarily that he had new ideas. It was that he had an idea that was consistent with what the base GOP voter wanted. And indeed, if you take a look, the red line there is what the average GOP voter thinks in terms of immigration. Oh, sorry, that's the GOP party elite in terms of whether or not they see immigration as a large threat. The red dotted line shows how the Republican base thinks about this. And again, the gap between these 2 points now is, approximating 50%. It's lessened a little bit in this last year, although the question is why is it lessened this last year? It might be because voters are now confident, GOP voters are confident, because Trump is president, that immigration is less of a problem. You also see a similar issue with respect to attitudes about free trade, in which essentially Republicans have grown more and more skeptical about free trade over time. And again, that is a larger gap in terms of dealing with that than the Democrats have had to deal with. And again, it's an issue where the GOP party elite might disagree with it, but because Trump is president, that is winding up being the policy that everyone is gravitating towards. So what are the long-term implications of this? They're not good. They really aren't. Among other things, you're going to be dealing with a situation in which, you have so many path-dependent policy outcomes in which capital, to paraphrase Mike Huckabee, essentially you're going to be in a situation where capital, rather than labor, gets hooked on Uncle Sugar, which is to say that capital gets hooked on a whole array of policies that essentially disproportionately benefit them, but nonetheless might be subject to change if Democrats or if the left were ever to come back in power. And so as a result, you are likely to see two things. First, an acceleration of rent seeking, which Jason and others have already done a fair amount of research on this. But you've certainly seen to some extent within the Trump administration already in terms of the degree of access that various billionaires have had to the White House and to various regulatory agencies, particularly the EPA. The second thing is that there was a paper that, I'm forgetting the authors, an NBER paper showing that when there was after the 2016 election outcome, essentially firms that were linked to CEOs or corporate executives that had visited the Obama White House, all of those firms saw a dramatic reduction in their stock market values after that election, with a recognition that suddenly firms that were seen as friendlier to Barack Obama now were going to face presumably some sort of political retribution from Donald Trump being in office. It is likely, therefore, that firms would expect the reverse to be true if the Republicans were voted out of office, which is to say, if they're in a situation where they are tight with Trump and then Trump loses or the GOP gets, blown out in the House, that makes them, potentially vulnerable, which gives them an incentive to double down in terms of siding with the right. And then, finally, the one aspect of the sort of pluto-populism that Donald Trump and others are promoting is that it creates a perfect doom loop, which is to say, as a general rule, Republicans usually run on the notion that government is the problem and not the solution, which gives Republicans in some ways something more of an out than Democrats do. Because if it turns out that Republicans badly run the government, well, all they get to do is just reiterate the message that they had been making in the first go-around of their election, which is to say, government is still the problem. You just need to vote us back into office so we can really, root them out. And so, while I don't think that this is obviously a permanent status, in which case we would potentially wind up becoming much more like Argentina, it is, at least for the time frame that I was suggested to write about this paper, the next 10 years, a disturbingly plausible scenario in which, even though it is possible Democrats will obviously win elections, they will do so in the face of opposition from high net worth individuals, not from their support. Thank you very much.
The last person of the day. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm not an economist, and so I'm glad I got the paper written by the political scientist. It paints a bleak portrait of what's happening in this country, and I should just mention that I am a Democratic pollster. It was not mentioned in my bio, but I poll for Democratic candidates for office, and so that bias will probably emerge in the course of my comments. So I just thought I would warn you now that that's the case. So certainly I feel bleak about this country. I felt bleak about this country after Trump was elected, and this paper makes me feel even worse. The argument that the inevitable march to national populism, as he calls it, leads to economic decline, caused in part by kind of the ultra-rich promulgating a set of policies through Republican elites that ultimately increase inequality and stifle economic growth, leading us to become Argentina. And frankly, it feels like a fairly accurate way of describing what the policies of the Trump administration, but we've got some better examples, I think, than what's happening at the national level, but looking at what's happening at the state level. So I would use the example of Kansas, where Governor Brownback, when he was elected in 2010, enacted sweeping changes to the tax code, which dramatically cut taxes and also redistributed that wealth throughout the state. He actually hired Art Laffer to help him write his tax policy, so it was truly trickle-down economics. And he was aided by the ultra-rich, so the Koch brothers, who you're all familiar with, and you may I'm sure you're aware of how much money they spend in elections in this country, and I'm sure you've all seen, if you don't live in DC, you've seen their ads. But you may not be aware of their level of involvement at the state level and their involvement in state legislative elections. And so most of the really bad things that have happened over the Obama years happened in the states, again, mostly as a product of the work of the Kochs and ALEC, which is an organization that basically it's a member organization of state legislators funded by Kochs and other corporate entities that creates sets of model legislation for legislators to introduce in legislatures, and of course all conservative, anti-labor, certainly regressive tax policies, but also things like stand your ground and other kinds of cultural issues. So at any rate, in Kansas, when Brownback introduced his plan, he couldn't actually get enough support from moderate Republicans in the legislature, so the Kochs came in, and the American for Prosperity ran a bunch of primaries against moderate Republicans, and were able to elect a bunch of conservative Republicans, and Brownback was able to pass his legislation and basically hollow out the state. So I think if you look at other states, I think Kansas is probably the most extreme example for a variety of reasons, but there are other states that have done some of this. So if you think about all the states where Republicans won complete control in 2010, and you think about Ohio and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and states like that, different governors have had various degrees of success. I would say Scott Walker was one of the more successful. And the Kochs actually, part of their company is based in Wisconsin. And when Walker was elected, they actually opened up a lobbying actual physical office, like right next to the Capitol when he was elected. And they were not just a source of a huge amount of money for independent expenditures, but also the recall elections. And, I'd say that while there have been very regressive economic policies in the state, he's probably best known for what he did to the labor movement. And there's been a 40% decline in in union membership in Wisconsin because of his ending collective bargaining rights for public employees. And again, different states with complete Republican control have done different things. Again, I think Brownback was the most successful by the Kochs measure, but other states have done various things. And so, I think that at least anecdotally, these kinds of arguments are borne out. But I think that this all assumes, and I'm going to go within the same 10-year frame, that there's no backlash, right? That these policies happen and they just sort of stay in place and it doesn't bother anybody. But in fact, we know what happened in Kansas. They hollowed out the state. people, including Republicans, were really unhappy. A bunch of people lost their seats, and the Republicans in the legislature passed a tax package that restored basically all of the cuts and changed the tax code basically back to the way it was before. And not only that, the governor vetoed it, and they overrode his veto on Republican votes in the Kansas legislature. And, you know, there have been other sorts of backlashes to these policies. The fact that the Republicans were unable to repeal Obamacare is, I think, sort of a perfect example, even though they control every lever of power and they have the backing of the ultra-rich. In doing this, they were not able to repeal Obamacare. Some of the trouble that I think they're facing on quote-unquote tax reform right now. I think that there are certain Republicans, the most obvious are the Republicans in the states that have high state and local taxes, but it's broader than that, especially with some folks in the Senate. So the notion that these leaders will kind of blindly carry out these policies, at least without regard to what the impact is, and certainly whether they care about what actually happens to people or what happens to them in re-election, you know, who knows? But there's no question that there are even Republicans in Congress who are worried about these policies and what the impact at least will be on their re-elect, if not perhaps the people in their state. So there's backlash against these policies, and so I think I think that backlash is happening in real time right now, and certainly. I'd also make one more point about that. It's not happening everywhere. So full disclosure, this is my client, but Governor Dayton in the state of Minnesota, and when he was elected in 2010, he had a Republican legislature. He did not make any spending cuts. He actually borrowed money against the school fund. And he ran on raising taxes on the rich. He was not able to get taxes on the rich in his first 2 years, but when they got complete control of the legislature in 12, they raised the taxes on the rich. Now, I know correlation is not causation, but the growth in Minnesota had an infrastructure around health care with the Mayo Clinic and others, and technology and high tech and medical devices and education. So, Minnesota was already in a better place than most states coming out of the recession and having that kind of infrastructure. But the growth in that state is pretty remarkable, the budget surplus. So it's sort of the opposite argument that you can't have these kind of Keynesian policies and get growth, at least at the state level in certain states. So there's backlash in real time against these policies. There's also, electoral backlash. And I guess it's too bad that we didn't do this last week and didn't just have these elections on Tuesday. And I'm not suggesting that what happened in Virginia and across the country was a sort of automatic backlash or vote against the kinds of economic policies that the ultra-rich /Trump / the Republicans in Congress like Paul Ryan want, but it's certainly a backlash against sort of the cultural, I believe, kind of the way that the interaction of kind of culture and economics that was so successful for Trump in his re-elect, which I think leads to some broader points about this country and how it's changing and how that might affect the ability of the ultra-rich to enact these sorts of policies. The first is obviously the growth of diversity in this country. This is the truth is the coalition that elected Donald Trump is literally dying. I mean, not only is it old, if you look at the death rates for white working class men in the Midwest especially, it's pretty grim. It's actually a relatively small part of the electorate, this kind of coalition of white working class in the Midwest that voted Donald Trump in. Now, it won't be till about 2060, okay, we get a majority of the electorate being minorities, because there are actual differences in voter registration rates and turnout rates. And so even though the country will be majority minority by like 2040, it'll take another 20 years for the Millennial generation and Gen Z or whatever it's called to actually supplant the baby booms that are generation that's so big, and also catch up as people age, they become more likely to vote. So there's all these dynamics that even when the country is majority minority, the electorate won't be, but it will be by 2060. But we're already seeing what the impact of minority turnout can do in elections, and 2008 is obviously a great example, where particularly among African Americans, we saw very high turnout. And one of the things that one of the miscalculations Republicans made in 2012, and I know this because I talked to Romney's pollsters, is that they assumed the share of the black vote in 2012 would be the same as 2008 because of everything that had happened over the past 4 years. I thought that was a very strange assumption to make, that African Americans would not turn out for Barack Obama to reelect him, but they did, and so their models were sort of off. But if you look at what happened in Virginia on Tuesday, the minority turnout matched the 2016 turnout in terms of proportion of the electorate. It wasn't necessarily higher, but it was the same proportion. And so, and that doesn't usually happen in midterm and certainly in off-year elections, which is why Republicans always do so much better in midterm and off-year elections, is that minority voters, especially Hispanics, are less likely to turn out. At the same time, we're seeing two sort of develop. If you look at the millennial generation, when John Kerry ran for president in 2004, that was the first year a Democrat had won a majority of under 30s. I don't know if they were millennials yet back then. There might have been some Gen Xers there. But he won 55% of millennials. And you know, of course, how Obama did with millennial voters. What happened in 2016 was a lot of millennials, a lot of white millennials did not support Clinton, especially younger white men, and many of them were supporters of Bernie Sanders. But also, minority millennial men turned out at much lower rates, and there was also a high proportion voting for third-party candidates, but they were not voting for Donald Trump. So this is an issue of lack of enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton and not turning out, but it wasn't sort of because they were voting for Trump. The millennials on Tuesday, 69% voted for Northam. I mean, that's actually higher than Obama got with millennials in Virginia. And they turned out at 2016 proportions again, which is, for an off-year election is quite high. So you have the growing diversity of this country. You also have the millennial generation, which while did not perform for Democrats the way we all would have liked in 2016, it doesn't suggest what happened in Virginia and in other places suggests to me that was a product of that actual election and the dynamics of that election, particularly the Democratic primary, more than any kind of drift of millennials to the right. And then you have another dynamic that actually, even though people just notice now that white blue-collar voters and white college-educated voters are really different from each other, that's actually a trend that's been happening for some time. Certainly, Obama did terribly. I mean, Clinton did worse, but Obama did terribly with white blue-collar voters. Clinton was really the last Democratic presidential candidate who did very well with white blue-collar voters. But if you look at what's happening with white college-educated women, this is a group that is becoming a kind of base Democratic constituency, and a group that is highly engaged and highly likely to vote. On Tuesday, Northam got 58% of white college-educated women. Clinton got 51% in 2016 among white college-educated women. And I think you're going to see the whatever you want to call this phenomenon, and I'm not sure what I want to call it yet, but I think you're going to see it in a lot of the suburban districts around the country where you have Republican incumbents. And that's why many of those seats are on the targeted list. So all this is to say that we've had an election in 2016 that from a Democratic perspective was obviously quite depressing, and the ultra-rich played a huge role, particularly at the state and local level, a little less so, frankly, on the national level because the Kochs didn't support Trump. But there's backlash, and you're seeing it both in real time in the reaction, say, to Kansas and in what happened in Congress, but also in who's getting riled up in the electorate. The other thing I would say about the ultra-rich is there's no question that with Citizens United, the floodgates opened and the amount of money being spent on the independent expenditure side is enormous, and it's being driven by very few donors. But we've also had the rise of small donors. And if you look at Obama, he was able to raise $1 billion with a high percentage from small donors online. Obviously, he had his hedge fund donors too, so he wasn't purely a small donor guy. But he was kind of the actually Howard Dean, honestly, was really the first person to show that you could kind of raise these small dollar amounts. But if you look at someone like Elizabeth Warren, I mean, she was able to make a pledge in her campaign to say no outside groups can come in because she could raise so much small dollar money. She didn't actually need Emily's List or the DSCC or anybody like that to kind of come in. And, I think she probably would have beat Brown anyway, but I think that was part of her winning, was that they pledged to keep the big money out and she could get it through small donors. And certainly if you look at Bernie Sanders, his money all came from, it was $27, was that the amount? Came from small donors. And, that was he raised a formidable amount of money. I'm not saying it compete with the Kochs, but it's still pretty substantial. And so I think if we look at the giving patterns in 2016 post-Trump, a lot of the progressive advocacy groups like ACLU and others are talking about record numbers of small donations, but we're also seeing it at the congressional level. There are actually, if you look back on the last 3 or 4 election cycles, usually in the summer, there's about 20 to 50 people who are running for Congress on either side who have $5,000 in the bank. This summer, there were 200 Democrats running who had $5,000 in the bank. I'm working in races right now where there are 10 people running in the primary, and at least 2 or 3 of the candidates have all raised $300,000 to $500,000 this year. They're not always my candidates, unfortunately, but some of them are my candidates. And so the amount of small, and then if you look at the groups with Indivisible and flipping the districts or whatever those groups are called, there's a huge amount of money and activity happening on the ground there. So there's a role for the grassroots, there's a role for small dollars that I believe, could counter some of the ultra-rich money. And do I have time to make 2 more points? I don't know what time I'm at. 1 point? Okay, I'll make 1 point then. I don't know what's going to happen the next 10 years, but the way you get political realignment is usually when there's some kind of exogenous shock to the system, like the Great Depression or World War II or those kinds of things that happen. I believe Russia could be one of those shocks to our system. I don't think we even know yet how far this goes, but my view is it could be as bad as Watergate and possibly worse, which could have the potential to realign this electorate. There's a discussion about polarization, most of which I agree with, though I think on economic issues there's less polarization. It's really on the cultural issues, on race and gender, where you see the polarization. There's actually a lot more ambivalence, lack of information, or even agreement around things like globalization if you look at the middle of the public. But it's really the culture and race issues where the polarization is. It's not economic issues. 29% of people favor the Republican tax plan. So it's really not on the economic issues except on the extremes. But a realigning election around something like this, I think, could potentially change the coalition, and you would probably get at least some of the libertarians who currently are independents or they're kind of free market Republican types who really hate Trump but voted for him anyway. You could imagine, a Democratic coalition that's much more pro-trade, certainly pro-immigration, pro-globalization, that's bigger than the current coalition, and it's certainly possible that the ultra-rich and those forces would be interested in working with that kind of Democratic Party. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much, Anna. If I could, I'm going to abuse the chair's privilege for a moment, make a couple comments, and then ask each of you a question. Comment 1, just apropos of Dan's paper and the figure of the Koch brothers and all that is, I do know a lot of really ultra 0.1% people who were anti-Trump and were poor Democrat. Some of them have even contributed to this institute through the years. I think it's a little scary to assign that much power to a few individuals without too much understanding or documentation of who those individuals are. You'll get to respond, but I'll come back to that. The second and much more important point, which I think I would appreciate both the speakers and some of the people in the audience to consider, is as the Peterson Institute for International Economics, we tend to focus on different issues. And so it was very refreshing for us to get this deep dive into primarily American politics. But I guess there are 2 questions that sort of come out of the international aspect in different senses. The first is we look around the world, and as a consumer of political science and political polling, we look at a world where the moderate left has essentially cratered throughout Western Europe. The moderate left party in Japan essentially cratered and got leapfrogged to the left. We have seen decline in more generally, at least again, as a consumer of your literature, a decline in the support for so-called establishment parties, no matter what. And this doesn't, at least at first glance, seem to correlate very well with the economic crisis. It's not like, as a naive economist would say, oh, well, the countries that had the worst crises have the most populace, right? That's not where we are. So I guess my first question to both of you is, how much is America exceptional how much is it the Koch brothers or the rise of the millennials with a lagged effect before they get to vote in large numbers and register, versus there is a general discrediting of the so-called mainstream parties, particularly the third-way moderate left, across the democracies. I'm not saying I'm glad about any of that. I just as an explanatory matter, I'm always struck by how much Americans tend to think America is always unique, and that's part of it. The second thing is going on the international economics as a question to both of you in a different frame, is we, for perhaps obvious reasons, care a lot about free trade. And one of the issues which Trump seems to focus on and seems to believe very devoutly is that free trade is bad. How much is this a major part of his support? You know, how much is it's a symbolic issue for just we don't like foreign people or we're really unhappy about Eastern elites, versus we genuinely, there is a constituency in the US that is truly anti-trade. And again, I know there's polling data on this. I'm not asking you to review that. I'm just asking for your assessment. But let me make it one notch more pointed. So, Dan, in your case, in your paper, you know, the big takeaway, I'm trying to think of a takeaway chart from each paper that we can promote on our fabulous social media website, www.pie.com. Follow us on Twitter, @PIAE. You know, I love I always love 4 quadrants, something, the little piggy bank in the one quadrant and nothing else. You know, there are a lot of people presumably in that piggy bank, in that quadrant, who care a lot about globalization and trade. So how much does that get traction versus other things? And for Anna, I'm not asking you to summarize the whole literature, obviously, and all these things. But in terms of when you speak about there hasn't been a Democrat who's appealed to white, rural, working class voters, I think is what you said. Certainly not white, rural, male, Midwestern voters for a while. Presidential. Sorry, presidential. Absolutely. Should we take the message then that Senator Schumer and others are right, that they should be anti-trade because that's how they will help get those people back or get those people more excited? Or is it possible for Dems to win without going in that direction? Anyway, just to get the discussion going.
So a couple of things. First, I will absolutely concede the point that obviously there are some plutocrats who were decidedly anti-Trump or never Trump, or and even might have been considered traditional conservatives, but decided they could not support this man. A few counters to that. The first is that there were many of these people, or many of these plutocrats in 2016, and then Trump won. And so, you know, you've seen to some extent the Koch brothers, for example, who sat out 2016 at the presidential level, decide, okay, we're going to have to work with, you know, we have to work with Trump, even if we disagree with him on a variety of issues. So I would say that on the Republican side, an awful lot of the big money donors have basically decided we have no choice. And as I said, this is, to be clear, this was always a second best choice for these people. They don't want to have to deal with all of the carnage that Trump brings with him, as it were. But again, that's their second best option. The other thing I would say is that, again, even though there are obviously some, people like Tom Steyer or George Soros who are obviously plutocrats and in no way, shape, or form Republicans, that's certainly true. However, what is interesting is that if you poll, for example, we're talking about sort of larger trends rather than individual exceptions. Certainly individual exceptions exist. But it is interesting, there's been work done recently by David Bruckman and Greg Ferenstein at Stanford, polling even Silicon Valley founders, and these are people who traditionally would be, on the left in terms of social issues and even potentially on economic issues, but on things like regulation and taxes, they don't sound like traditional Democrats, which gives rise to something that, or a potential tension that Anna identifies or talks about, which is the extent to which Democrats will be a big tent party in the sense of both having Bernie Sanders type folks who are, genuinely economic populists, but also what we might consider the more traditional third way types that say, yes, we obviously want to have more fairness, but we need to realize the value of Silicon Valley or the value of free trade and so on and so forth. And if the Democratic Party can reconcile those two different visions, then yes, I think it's fair to say that they have potential for success over the next decade. I'm just not sure they can do that, and I'm not sure whether that is possible. To answer your other questions on whether or not this is unique, whether this is an American exceptional story, no, I don't think it is. I mean, in some ways, everything that I said would also apply to the United Kingdom as well as the United States. So in that sense, it's just Anglo-American. But I think, the trends that we're talking about, which is the rise of political polarization and the rise of economic inequality, are not unique to the United States. And as you point out, moderate left parties have been decimated in Europe. Moderate right parties have been somewhat decimated in Europe as well. So this is not unique to the United States. The thing that is unique to the United States, however, is the campaign financing mechanism. So that's the part where that's the reason why I focused on the U.S., because it's not so much that these larger trends don't matter, it's that what capital decides to do with this does matter. And so the choice, I think, in terms of siding with Republicans versus siding with Democrats is more consequential in the United States than it is in potentially other countries where campaigns are, by law, much more heavily truncated, and there are far greater restrictions on what various parties can do in terms of running for office. So I think that's the one way in which I do think there is an American exceptionalism, and that's why I focus primarily on the United States. And in terms of your last question, I will defer to Anna mostly on this because she probably knows the answer better than I do. But I will say on the attitudes about trade, was it trade qua trade, or was it trade as a symbol of political identity? All of the studies I've seen suggested was the latter, that this was primarily about globalization seen as an example of changing the country in ways that particularly white working class did not like, because suddenly they were less socially powerful than they used to be. And so as a result, and that's why immigration, even more than trade, was the sort of classic hot button issue. And that's also the issue where, if you look at the polling data, there is an even greater divorce between what party elites feel and what the party base feels.
On trade, I agree with you. There really isn't a pro or anti-trade constituency, broad-based constituency in this country. Actually, most people have no idea. So I did a fair amount of polling around TPP, and see, I don't even know. And it's true. And the main thing is, if you actually ask people questions about it, you realize it's not a big issue in their lives. They don't follow it. They don't know. They don't care. And so what happens is people, follow the signals from their party. So Democrats should be against free trade. But since Barack Obama was for free trade, low information Democrats were for free trade. And you actually saw, if you look at, there's not a lot of tracking, but if you look at African American opinion on trade, it flips when Barack Obama becomes, becomes this proponent of free trade. And same on the Republican side, right? So, but the reason why, but you usually can see those kinds of shifts when people are low information and not ideological about it, that what their leaders say tends to sort of, push them around. So, for example, Republicans are much more favorable to Russia than they were before the election. So they used to be more hostile than Democrats, and now they're they used to be more hostile to Russia than Democrats, and now they're less hostile than Democrats. So I don't think there is, and I think it was completely symbolic, and I think it was less about immigrants and more about jobs, that he had a simple answer on jobs, a simple explanation that made sense to people, because it's actually true that globalization has led to job loss and jobs going overseas, and so it was easy to blame NAFTA and other trade agreements, for the kind of economic dislocation. So, in the exit polls, people were much more likely to think Trump had a plan to create jobs than Hillary Clinton did, and his main job besides infrastructure was trade. So there's a piece of it that's around immigration and globalization, but I think it was just a very simple way for him to say he knew something about jobs and how to bring back jobs and how to create jobs. I want to respond to a point that you made at the end. I don't think there's nearly as much division within the Democratic Party than the media would like to suggest there is. First of all, Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. Second of all, most of his candidates have lost. I mean, there's been almost no Bernie-backed candidate has actually won since the 2016 election. And if you look within the Democratic Party, across the spectrum, and this is actually something that I was thinking about when you showed your slide on the gap between Republican elites and Republican in the public. Democrats are wildly, love their party, like 90% favorable across the board for people who identify as Democrats, remembering that Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. If you look at the Republicans, no, it matters that he's not. If you look at the Republicans, I've been just doing this analysis today, and I have this group of people I call party line Republicans, and they are Republicans on every single thing, and 70% are unfavorable towards the party, towards the Republicans in Congress. And it's a really striking difference the way people feel about their own parties. So there's actually much more Democratic unity within the, than the kind of the Donna Brazile, Bernie stuff would lead you to believe. And I think there was a hairbreadth difference between Clinton and Sanders on policy in almost every area. And I don't think it's that hard to come up with unifying economic policy within the Democratic Party.
Thank you very much. We can get a mic here, and then your nearest standing mic, if you could just go right there.
Neil Marotra, Brown University. I guess there's a question for both of you about drilling down a little bit more on sort of whether 2016 was about economic stagnation versus the sort of rapid diversification of the U.S. and the growth of the minority communities in the U.S. If you look at sort of the percentage of the population that is foreign-born, this point, I believe that today is the highest point since the early 1920s. The early 1920s were also a period of backlash. It led to a pretty draconian immigration law in 1924 that wasn't changed for 40 years. But that was not a time of economic stagnation. And so I'm wondering, and this gets, I guess, to Adam's question about, well, we see a lot of the same sort of things in politics going on in Western Europe, where there isn't the same degree of, there is economic slowdown, but there isn't the same degree of inequality. So I was wondering if you can sort of touch on how you think, if you reran 2016 with 1990s style economic growth, you have the same thing.
So I think the quick answer is that if you reran 2016 with 1990 level, well, let's say 1999 levels of economic growth, or even 1969 levels of economic growth, no, you wouldn't have the same result. So there's all the research I've seen on this does not give an either-or answer to this question, which is to say, if someone tells you it's only about economic stagnation, they are lying. And if someone tells you it's only about political identity, honestly, I think they've got a slightly stronger case, but they're not being accurate as well. Because in some ways, the places that Trump did well in were places that might not have been economically stagnant right now, but clearly they could, in polling, there was an indication that they thought there was trouble ahead, and that was one of the drivers for flocking to someone like Donald Trump. Was that, now I'm blanking, what was the larger question? Or that was the question? Yeah. Yeah. So, I would say, but again, and this is why I think the productivity slowdown plays such a large role in my story, which is to say that because of the productivity slowdown, essentially the parties on the left can't make the same compact that they could have 20 years ago. Now, it is possible, partially this is also the perception of plutocrats. In other words, if they do believe that there's a way to jumpstart economic growth and it's coming from the left, then that actually potentially matters. But I would argue that to date that's not necessarily, that's not the message necessarily coming from the Democrats. We'll see what happens come 2018 or 2020.
Most of the post-election analysis I've seen suggests it's a mix of both, but more heavily weighted towards race and cultural issues. But I do think there's a piece of this that matters around a group of Democratic voters who came out for Obama but are really, really economically challenged and depressed and disconnected. And so if you look at where turnout dropped for Democrats, it tended to be among some of the more economically challenged folks relative to 08 and 12. So there is a kind of demobilizing aspect of struggling economically, and if the party that is in power that you voted for doesn't produce, wage growth, it's hard to get excited to go out and vote next time for, say Hillary Clinton. So while it may not have driven the white, blue collar Midwest surge in support for Trump, or at least not all of it, there's also a piece of kind of demobilization on the Democratic side that I think is a result of wage stagnation.
Just to add to that, I've seen research that suggests that this is another way in which the United States is distinct from Europe, because there are instances where in Europe, when if there's a negative economic shock, there's a sufficiently large social safety net so that those who are negatively affected, who would probably be more likely to vote Labor or vote, Social Democrat, are not, not so impoverished that they stop voting. Whereas on the other hand, in the United States, that's one of the effects, is that if you have a negative economic shock, voters who might traditionally vote Democrat, if they wind up falling below the poverty line, they just stop voting. That's one of the responses.
This is an interesting parallel in political terms to something Karen Dinan raised in her earlier paper, in which she talked about one of the potential fiscal feedbacks was that if you have lower productivity growth, you may have lower labor supply. You'll have people saying it's not worth working. So. And that, of course, can become a reinforcing cycle. I'm disenfranchised politically, I'm disenfranchised economically. It's something to add to the cheery interpretations of this section. No, please, Beck.
Thanks. I'm Caroline Atkinson. I thought that these papers were, or the paper and the discussion were tremendously interesting, as are your comments now. I want to take issue with the notion of secular stagnation, or that the determinism about how that deal is no longer available. And in two different ways. One is that the whole argument about the Bernie Sanders sort of, let's talk about redistribution and not growth, that debate has been going on the left for a really long time. It wasn't a new phenomenon in 2016. There's been should we grow the pie, or should we just redistribute it as an either or rather than as a positive sum has been around for a long time. So it's not new. On the other hand, what is new is, I think, is this sort of depressed notion that that Keynes no longer works, and that governments can no longer borrow to fund whether it's infrastructure or other things. And I think it's striking that is believed so strongly, including in the Democratic Party. And I think that research suggests that it shouldn't be, and the work that Adam and others have done. And we shouldn't just buy into the notion of secular stagnation. So those are more two comments. And I just want a third comment about Europe, which is maybe different on this identity point. The far right in Germany, as I'm sure you know, did much better in states where immigrants are like less than 2% of the population. So it was not, it was anti-immigration from people who were not really affected. And a similar thing in the UK, which seems a little different from the proposition that Neil was putting forward.
So a few things. First of all, the secular stagnation thing is an assumption built into this entire project. So I'm
sorry, I have to halt you there.
Yeah.
There's a distinction between an assumption of persistent low productivity growth than a presumption of secular stagnation. Secular stagnation is a particular set of causes that can be rectified through government policy and is a demand-based assumption. We are being open-minded. We're just saying if it stays low, what happens?
Right. And so basically that's the operating assumption I was making writing this paper. On the Bernie Sanders point, I agree with you that in some ways this debate is not, new on the left. What is new is that Bernie Sanders did as well as he did with that message in 2016, and the degree to which the 2017 party, despite what Anna said, does look, has shifted to the left. And indeed, you can argue even in 2016, Bernie was successful in the sense of getting someone like Hillary Clinton, who was thought of as a new Democrat, someone who was relatively friendly to free trade, to come out and oppose TPP, even though she had, was talking about it being the gold standard trade agreement when she was Secretary of State, which is not a high moment in her campaign. I do think the anti-immigration point, though, I completely agree with you, and I would actually point out it's not unique to Europe. It's also true in the United States, where in some ways, geographically in the United States, the greatest hostility to immigrants in the U.S. is not in places that have high levels of immigrants. It's not in places like Texas or California. It's in places like the industrial Midwest.
I would just want to make the point about Keynes. Part of the reason why I brought up the Minnesota example is because that's a state where Governor Dayton employed a Keynesian, approach to dealing with the recession, and it worked. Again, with lots of other caveats about the infrastructure in that state. But I do think that, and I just say this with my personal experience of working with Democrats running for office, that there is great fear about talking about government spending, which we usually call investment. To somehow hide the fact that we're talking about spending. And it is, it's come out of the party top down to some degree, particularly because of what is considered the congressional battleground is very conservative. I mean, because of gerrymandering, there are very few competitive districts, and the ones that we see as potentially competitive are mostly lean Republican districts. And one of the things that I've said to my clients is that, and I think part of, because we see great resistance to taxing and spending from the voters, but what I think has happened at the same time, if you look at decline in trust in institutions and in government, it is hard for Democrats to make arguments about spending when government has failed people so spectacularly over the last 15 years. I mean, obviously, since Watergate, decline in trust in government's been going down, but Katrina, through the Iraq War, through the rollout of healthcare.gov and on, and then also the fact that, government bailed out, Wall Street and no one went to jail, and everyone's doing just fine at the top and people are still struggling. And so you've got, under both Democratic and Republican presidents, a real failure of government in lots of respects. And so when Democrats go out and talking about spending, they're confronting real hostility to the notion that government can do anything, do it effectively. So, I mean, what I've recommended to my clients is talking about that there's no reason why as Democrats we shouldn't think government should work better. So Governor Dayton, and then I also work with Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania, we have these reform agendas where we're like consolidating departments, and we cut $2 billion in spending out of the Pennsylvania budget through departmental consolidation and eliminating positions that were unfilled and that sort of thing without actually cutting any actual spending on any programs. But there's a lot of resistance among Democrats to talking about the fact that government actually needs to work better because it's perceived as then an attack on government, and then you're now spouting the Republican line that government is the problem. So there's a lot of work to be done because there's a lot of skittishness, I think appropriately so in some ways, in talking about spending because government is viewed so poorly.
Terrific. I think we have one more question at the back mic, please.
Just trying to find
You identify yourself,
sorry.
please.
Kim Elliott, Center for Global Development. And just trying to find some way sort of out of the mess. It seems like when you combine the polarization that Dan talked about, and especially the fact of just the attitudes of not even wanting to compromise, not just hating one another, with the rules in Congress. I mean, Congress has just become completely dysfunctional. It can't do anything, it seems. And so I'm just wondering, so it seems like campaign finance thinks of the Supreme Court. We can't do anything about that in the short run. Redistricting, there's some momentum, but with geographic sorting, not clear how far that would get us. Redistricting reform, that is. There's some of these, ideas, in political science on different voting rules. And I'm just wondering, A, are there any of those that could be effective? B, is there any political path to getting changes in political rules that might pull us more back to the center?
Yeah, so the answer to your last question takes care of the first one, which is no. There's no political, I mean, you're talking about, constitutional changes that are, let me put it this way. There is one way in which this happens, which is you're starting to see at least some slow movement towards, the Article 5 Constitutional Convention. Was it Wisconsin that just passed the legislature just passed that? And so, if you get up to 38 states, then you could have a constitutional convention which could potentially address these issues. I would humbly suggest that putting your eggs in that basket is really super dangerous because there are so many worse outcomes if you actually go that route. I really would advocate a strong min-max strategy when it comes to thinking about a constitutional convention. I think there are two ways out that you could potentially see, and I do want to hear Anna's thoughts on this. Option one, which you can argue did happen between 2008 and 2010, was you had such a massive shock that you had Democrats in control of all three, of the House, the Senate, and the White House, and had sufficient control of the Senate so that there was there was very little that could be done by Republicans to slow things down. And you actually had a relatively large burst of legislation passed as a result of that. Now, the after effects of that were relatively significant. You usually only get that kind of control of all the branches of government for a very short period of time. The other answer, and again, this goes back to Anna's point, is that there can be an exogenous shock that really genuinely does scramble political coalitions. I don't think that Russia is going to do that, because for that to be the case, you would actually have to have Republicans really accept the fact of that there was collusion, show evidence of collusion. You would need so many smoking guns that even Fox News would have to cover it. And I'm a little.
I think those smoking guns.
You think they? I'm more. So this is where I'm more dubious. As a general rule, as a political scientist, if I'm asked to choose in terms of explaining what's happening, is it incompetence or is it malevolence? I take incompetence 99 times out of 100. And with the Trump administration, I'm definitely betting on incompetence. But that said, the last time you've had this is the scary answer. The last time you had a period in this country where you had this high degree of income inequality, this high a degree of political polarization, and also this high degree of low trust in institutions was right before, basically the turn of the 20th century, the start of the 20th century. And the easy answer to that is, well, we fixed that problem with World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. I would not recommend that as a policy solution, but if you have macro shocks like that, that will scramble the electorate.
Well, I guess it's really an empirical question whether or not the smoking guns exist, and we'll know soon enough. But having done a fair amount of research on Russia, right now people are sort of, I haven't done it since the indictments came down for Gates and Manafort, but there's pretty broad agreement that if there's evidence of collusion with the Trump campaign, even if the president, there's no evidence that he knew anything about it, that you get pretty broad chunks of Republican voters who believe it's grounds for impeachment. And I think there's an argument that can be made around small d democracy, about security, about America's role in the world, around Russia that has nothing to do with, partisan politics. So I think there's a way there. But what I would say is look at what's happening in states. There's almost nothing can happen at the federal level, but what happens in states is really important. And so I think just like the backlash about what happened, the backlash in Kansas, and I think you're going to see in 2018 a bunch of these state houses where there was a Republican sweep in 2010, going to finally get rid of some of those folks. And I think you're going to see some pretty big changes. But innovation and attitude change usually happens in the states. So if you take something like gay marriage, you have a bunch of states that start passing domestic partnerships, then they start marriage equality, and then you start seeing same with marijuana. So these are cultural issues, but you see more rapid opinion change when lots of states do things and there's big campaigns that educate people. And so I think it's more than possible that and you're already starting to see Republican governors like Sandoval in Nevada, even Kasich to some degree in Ohio, expanding Medicaid, innovating around healthcare costs. So I think because of the reality that they have to govern and they have to balance the budget and they have to deal with people who don't have health insurance. So my cause for hope is what's happening at the state level. I think it's going to take a long time for the national level to be much different.
Thank you both. This has been terrific. We're at the 5:30 hour. So this is our official closing time. I'm just going to add one small word before I close with thank you. So we did manage to get through this last session without mentioning the word productivity very much. And that's in part the challenge that we gave Daniel and Anna. But I just wanted to pick up, and this relates to something that was said in an earlier session. I believe Krishna Guha may have said it, but also what Anna was saying about state and local level, and then some of the issues having to do with differential rewards across companies. I think a good research topic for us to think about, and I'd be interested after the session in hearing from our colleagues whether or not that's the case, is what political dynamic happens if you have more in-depth geographic sorting than we already do. So, the rewards of being urban for people who can stomach the urban culture go up. The problems, the persistence of unemployment and underinvestment in regions where the urban culture and the Google, Amazon, whatever wonderful job creators gets worse. And we are seeing this also, we mentioned some of the comparative international stuff. We've seen this in the UK with so much concentrated in London, and then Wales or Northern England votes for Brexit, but then doesn't attract the kinds of migration and the kinds of investment that you want. Similarly, in Eastern Germany, Alternativen für Deutschland, very strong in the former DDR states, where there was a hollowing out. So I'm hoping this is not the case, but I think particularly in light of Anna's very important points about in the US system, activity taking place at the state level politically and in policy terms, worrying about this geographic aspect of bad productivity, bad politics cycles. And again, for the record, when I say bad politics, this is not partisan. This is about bad politics leading to extremist outcomes or incompetent outcomes, not about, Anna's free to be as partisan as she likes, but let me be just clear. We're talking about, when we refer to bad politics, we mean extremist, non-evidence-based, illiberal in the fundamental sense. We're not talking about a particular party. Anyway, I'm very grateful to Daniel and to Anna for coming into this, maybe not Lion's Den, but Economist's Den. I'm very grateful to all of you, both in person and online, who stuck with us through a day that I think was extremely rewarding. Lots of substance, lots to think about. Many of you, the authors in the room, I owe a special debt to. I'm especially grateful, of course, to German Zettelmeyer for doing so much to shepherd this project. We will continue to put out papers on this topic. Thanks to the ZIF Foundation, we will be publishing a conference volume, but also promoting some of these specific charts through our means. And this meeting is adjourned.